The morning Martin Calloway walked into the dresser group's headquarters, he was wearing a jacket he'd owned for 11 years and shoes that needed resoling. The receptionist glanced at him, the way people glance at delivery men who've come to the wrong floor. A quick, efficient dismissal, then back to her screen. He didn't correct her. He rarely did. At 61, Martin had the kind of face that didn't announce itself. Crow's feet from decades of squinting at spreadsheets under bad office lighting. Hands that looked like they'd done actual work because they had. He drove a 2009 Volvo with a cracked dashboard and a back seat that still held a child's booster seat. Though his daughter hadn't needed one in years, he paid for his own dry cleaning. He remembered the names of janitors. None of this was performance. It was just who he was. What was not immediately visible, what almost no one knew unless they'd done serious due diligence, was that Martin Calloway owned Calloway Precision Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing firm out of Columbus, Ohio, that had quietly become the backbone supplier for 3 of the largest aerospace contractors in the country, 47 patents, 260 employees. Profit margins that made analysts blink and rerun their numbers. He had built it without venture capital, without a famous last name, without a single magazine profile. He had built it the way his father had taught him to build anything worth keeping, slowly, carefully, and without needing anyone to watch. He had one daughter. Her name was Sophie, and she was 7 years old, and she was the reason he had agreed to come to New York at all. The dressers had reached out through an intermediary in March. By April, the calls had become insistent. By May, Martin had finally agreed to a meeting. Not because he needed their money, but because Sophie's mother had died 14 months earlier, and Martin was trying, in the quiet and practical way he tried everything, to figure out what the next 20 years of his life should look like, whether it made sense to keep running a company this demanding alone, whether there was a version of stability that didn't require him to miss another school play. He had told Sophie he'd be back by Thursday. It was Tuesday morning, and he was standing in the lobby of a building that smelled like marble and money, and the specific kind of confidence that comes from never having lost anything important. The dresser group occupied the top 4 floors of a midtown tower. The elevator required a key card, which the receptionist provided with the measured courtesy of someone who had been trained to be polite to everyone and warm toward no one. Martin rode up alone, watching the floor numbers climb, and thought about Sophie's question from the night before. "Are they nice people, Daddy?" He had said he didn't know yet. The conference room was long and cold, and decorated with the kind of art that costs a great deal and communicates nothing. 3 people were already seated when Martin was shown in. He recognized 2 of them from photographs. Gerald Dresser sat at the head of the table. He was 73, silver-haired, immaculate, in a way that suggested he had never once in his life been caught unprepared. He had built the Dresser Group from his father's regional banking operation into a diversified holding empire worth somewhere north of $4 billion, depending on who was doing the estimating and what they chose to count. He was the kind of man who entered rooms expecting them to rearrange themselves around him, and in Martin's experience, rooms generally obliged. To Gerald's left sat his son, Philip Dresser, 44, Wharton MBA. He had his father's jawline and none of his patience, which was saying something, because Gerald Dresser was not a patient man. Philip had run 2 of the group's subsidiaries with competence, which he wore like a medal he expected others to comment on. The third person was a woman named Carol Stein, the group's chief acquisitions officer, who had orchestrated the outreach to Martin and who now sat with a leather portfolio open in front of her and a pen she hadn't yet uncapped. Martin shook hands with all 3, sat where he was directed to sit, and declined coffee. "We appreciate you making the trip," Gerald said. His voice had the texture of old wood, dense, deliberate, shaped by decades of saying exactly what he meant to say and nothing more. "Of course," Martin said. There was a pause. Gerald let it sit there, which Martin recognized as a technique. He had seen it before. The silence was meant to make the other person feel the need to fill it, to offer something, to position themselves. Martin had no particular interest in filling silences. He waited. Gerald studied him with the frank assessment of a man who had spent 50 years deciding what things were worth. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. Martin smiled, just slightly. "What did you expect?" "Someone more." Gerald paused, choosing carefully. "Promotional. I've never needed to be." That landed. Martin saw Philip shift in his chair, a small adjustment that meant something had registered in a way he hadn't anticipated. Carol opened her portfolio. "We've reviewed your financials for the past 8 years," she said, moving things onto professional ground with the efficiency of someone who preferred it there. "The margins are exceptional. The patent portfolio is undervalued by most conventional metrics, and your supplier relationships are," she paused, searching for the right word, "unusually loyal." "My suppliers have been with me for an average of 11 years, Martin said. "I pay on time. I don't renegotiate contracts when times get hard for them. I show up when they need someone to show up." He said it plainly, without pride, as though he were describing the weather. Gerald was watching him with an expression Martin couldn't quite read. "You started the company from a machine shop in 1998, Gerald said. "Correct? 1997. "The machine shop was 98. You didn't finish your engineering degree." There it was. Martin had been expecting something like it. "No," he said. "I left in my junior year. My father had a medical situation. I went home to help run his shop, and never went back. I never needed to." Philip leaned forward slightly. "Our portfolio companies have certain standards around leadership credentials. It's not a personal judgment, it's structural. Our institutional investors expect a particular." "Philip." Gerald said it quietly, and Philip stopped. Gerald looked at Martin. "What my son is trying to say, Mr. Calloway, is that a partnership of the scale we're discussing would require some adjustments to how Calloway Precision presents itself publicly. We would be bringing significant capital, significant infrastructure, significant credibility." "I understand what you'd be bringing," Martin said. "Then you understand that in exchange, we would need the public face of the company to reflect our standards." Martin was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the city moved in its usual indifferent rush. He thought about the machine shop. He thought about his father's hands, rough in the same places his own hands were rough, and the afternoon his father had told him that a man who needs to tell you he's trustworthy probably isn't. "Can you say that plainly?" Martin said. Gerald looked at him steadily. "We would want to install a CEO with a profile more consistent with our other holdings. You would retain a significant operational advisory role. Your equity position would be, you want me to hand over my company and take a title that doesn't mean anything." The room was very quiet. "We want to position the company for institutional scale growth," Gerald said. It requires me to stop being the person who runs it." Gerald didn't flinch. "It requires you to let people with the appropriate background lead it into the next phase." Martin set his hands flat on the table. They were quiet hands, steady, the kind that didn't move much when their owner was thinking. "Mr. Dresser," he said, "I have 47 patents filed in my name and my name alone. I have supplier contracts that exist because those people trust me specifically. Not my company, not a brand, me. I have engineers who turned down better-paying jobs at Boeing and Lockheed because they wanted to work for someone they believed in." He paused. "If you put a stranger's name on the door, you're not buying Calloway Precision. You're buying the furniture." Philip made a sound that was almost a laugh, not warm. "We're offering," Philip said, $1.1 billion. That's a number that tends to resolve most philosophical concerns. Martin looked at him. He didn't look angry. He looked, if anything, a little tired. The way a man looks when he has driven a long way and arrived somewhere he didn't particularly want to be. "I know what you're offering," Martin said. "I read the term sheet, then you understand. I understand that you've structured this to acquire the revenue and eliminate the person who generates it. That's not a partnership. That's a conversion." He picked up his pen. He'd brought his own, a cheap ballpoint he'd had for years, and set it back down. "I've seen what your group does with companies it acquires. I did my research, Mr. Dresser. 2 of your manufacturing subsidiaries lost more than 30% of their senior staff within 18 months of acquisition. One of them lost its largest client 6 months after that." Carol Stein had stopped writing. Gerald's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. He had not, Martin suspected, been prepared for that. "Those situations were anomalies," Gerald said. "They were patterns," Martin said gently. "There's a difference." The silence this time was different, longer. Gerald Dresser looked at Martin Calloway across the long table, with its useless art and its cold air, and its view of a city that had made and unmade 1,000 men with better credentials and worse instincts. And for the first time in the meeting, He seemed to be actually seeing who was in front of him. "You came here knowing you were going to say no," Gerald said. "It wasn't quite an accusation. I came here to see if I was wrong about you," Martin said. "I wasn't." He stood, buttoned his jacket, the 11-year-old ones slightly worn at the left cuff, and extended his hand. Gerald shook it after a moment, with something that might have been respect, or might have been the beginning of it. Philip did not stand. Carol Stein watched Martin walk to the door, and then she uncapped her pen for the first time and wrote something in her portfolio. Martin never found out what it was. He called Sophie from the lobby. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been waiting. She was staying with his sister in Brooklyn while he was in the city, and his sister had probably let her stay up past her bedtime, which was something he would address later and not particularly mind. "Hi, Daddy." "Hi, sweetheart. How are you doing?" "Good. Aunt Diane made pancakes for dinner. Is that okay?" "That's fine. How was your meeting?" Martin pushed through the revolving door and stepped onto the sidewalk. The air was warmer than it had been in Columbus that morning. A cab honked at a bike messenger. A woman in expensive shoes walked past him without looking up from her phone. "It was okay," he said. "I don't think we're going to do business with these particular people." A pause. "Are you coming home sooner?" "Tomorrow morning, first flight, okay." Another pause. He could hear cartoons in the background. "Daddy? Yeah? Were they nice?" He thought about Gerald Dresser's voice, that old wood texture, the way it had shifted almost imperceptibly when Martin had named his numbers back to him. He thought about the look on Philip's face, not malice exactly, just the blankness of a man who has never had to wonder whether he belonged in a room. He thought about Carol Stein's pen, uncapping at the very end. "They were what they were," Martin said. "It's okay." Sophie seemed to accept this. She said goodnight. He said goodnight. He stood on the sidewalk for another moment, watching the city do what cities do, and then he walked 2 blocks to where he'd parked the Volvo, which had cost him $12 in a garage on 51st Street. What happened to the Dresser Group in the 18 months that followed was not immediate, and it was not dramatic, and it was not the kind of thing that ends up in newspapers, because newspapers prefer cleaner stories. But it was real. The aerospace sector contracted sharply in the 3rd quarter of that year. 3 of Dresser's aerospace-adjacent portfolio companies took significant losses. The group had been attempting quietly to build up a supply chain position in precision manufacturing, the kind of position that Calloway Precision's network would have provided had Martin signed. Without it, they were exposed. They made 2 other acquisitions in that space. Both were smaller firms, less stable, built on thinner relationships. One of them lost its FAA certification within 14 months. The other was absorbed by a competitor in a distressed sale. Philip Dresser left the group in the spring to pursue other opportunities, which is what press releases say when they mean something else. Carol Stein sent Martin a brief email in November. She didn't explain why, she just wrote, "Your instincts were right. I hope things are going well for you." He wrote back, "Thank you. They are. They were." Calloway Precision closed a strategic partnership with a European aerospace consortium in October, a deal Martin had been building quietly for 2 years, long before the Dressers had ever called. The terms were better than anything on the Dressers' term sheet. More importantly, the consortium had no interest in replacing Martin. They wanted him specifically. They had done their homework. At the closing dinner in Munich, the consortium's chairman, a tall Finnish man named Heikkinen, who said very little and noticed everything, raised a glass across the table at Martin and said, "You are not what we expected." Martin smiled. "What did you expect?" Heikkinen considered. "Someone who needed us more. I needed the right partner," Martin said. "There's a difference." Heikkinen nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. Martin flew home the next day. He landed in Columbus at noon, drove the Volvo from the long-term lot, stopped at the school to pick up Sophie, and sat in the pickup lane behind a line of newer cars while she came out in her blue coat, dragging her backpack by one strap the way she always did, looking around for him with the particular focus of a child who has learned to find what she's looking for. She spotted the car. Her face changed in the way that faces change when they see exactly what they were hoping to see. He got out to help with her backpack. She let him. "How was school?" he said. "Good. We learned about rivers." "Which rivers?" "All of them, kind of, but mostly the Mississippi." He put her backpack in the back seat and held the door for her. She climbed in and buckled her own seatbelt, which she had recently become very proud of doing herself. "Daddy," she said as he pulled out of the lot. "Yeah, are we going to be okay?" He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window at the flat Ohio landscape, at the gas stations and the strip malls and the sky, which was that particular pale blue of late November, clean and cold and very wide. "Yes, sweetheart," he said. "We're going to be fine." He meant it. He had always been better at knowing what things were worth than other people expected. It was, in the end, the only advantage he had ever really needed. The Volvo moved through the afternoon traffic, unhurried, unremarkable, carrying nothing that announced itself, and everything that mattered.